She counted the bills one more time, even though she already knew what they'd say. 2 fives. That was it. That was everything. Nora Calloway spread them flat on her lap, smoothing the creases with fingers that had forgotten what clean felt like, and stared at the face of Abraham Lincoln like he might offer some kind of wisdom about what comes next when you've reached the absolute bottom. The Greyhound hummed beneath her, eating up miles of West Virginia backroad, with the steady indifference of a machine that doesn't care where you're going or why. Outside the window, the mountains rolled past, in waves of green and gray, ridge after ridge, disappearing into the September haze. Beautiful country if you had the luxury of thinking about beauty. Nora didn't. She was 22 years old and owned nothing. Not a cent in the bank. Not a person to call. Not a place to sleep tonight or tomorrow night or the night after that. Just a backpack wedged between her feet. A change of clothes that smelled like rest stop soap. And $10 that had taken her a week of careful rationing to save. She'd been riding buses for 2 years now. Not going anywhere specific, just moving because standing still felt like drowning. 2 years of motion without direction. 2 years of Greyhound stations and gas station bathrooms, of sleeping on benches with her backpack under her head and her jacket pulled over her shoulders. 2 years of being invisible, of perfecting the art of taking up as little space as possible, of sitting in corners with a book and looking like she was waiting for someone who was just about to arrive. She'd gotten good at it. The looking like you belong. The blending in. The careful choreography of homelessness that keeps people from seeing what you really are. She knew which rest stops had the cleanest bathrooms, which vending machines gave the most calories per dollar, which station attendants would look the other way if you curled up in a waiting area after midnight. She knew how to wash her face in fluorescent light while staring at a mirror that showed her a stranger, how to make a cup of coffee last 3 hours, how to move through the world like smoke. But the $10 in her lap represented something more than money. It represented the end of something. She'd been saving it without really knowing why, putting aside $1 here and 50 cents there from the odd jobs she picked up, the day labor nobody else wanted. Washing dishes at a truck stop for 4 hours. Stocking shelves at a convenience store that paid cash. Holding a sign for a tax service on a street corner in Charleston. Standing in the rain for minimum wage. The $10 was supposed to be for something important. An emergency. A crisis. A moment when she'd need it more than she needed it right now. But sitting on that bus watching the mountains slide past Nora, couldn't imagine what that moment might look like. This was already the emergency. This was already the crisis. There was no bottom below this bottom. The bus stopped in Huntington to pick up passengers, and 2 men climbed aboard and took the seats directly in front of her. Working men, both of them wearing boots with steel toes and flannel shirts with the sleeves rolled up to show forearms marked by sun and labor. They smelled like diesel fuel and cigarettes. One of them had a thermos that he unscrewed with hands that looked like they'd been fixing things since birth. They didn't notice Nora. People rarely did anymore. She'd learned to fade into bus seats to become part of the upholstery. It was a survival skill, but that meant she heard everything. Railroad Salvage Auction Saturday. The one with the thermos said, Summers County. They're selling off old equipment stuff that's been sitting on dead spurs for decades. Any of it worth a damn? His companion asked. Most of it's scrap, but there's a passenger car old Pullman sleeper from the 40s sitting on a section of abandoned track outside Talcott. Nobody bid on it at the last auction. The second man snorted. Wonder why? Railroad's letting it go for $10 just to clear it from the books. Whoever buys it gets the car and the right to use the 200 feet of track it sits on. Belongs to some defunct rail company that doesn't even exist anymore. $10. Nora leaned forward slightly. Not enough to be noticed, just enough to hear better. You going to bid? The second man asked. Hell no. Thing's probably rusted through. Interior's rotted out guaranteed. Not worth the gas money to drive out there and look at it. They moved on to talking about a football game, and the conversation was over. But for Nora, something had shifted. She sat back in her seat and looked down at the two $5 bills in her lap, then out the window at the green hills rolling past in the fading afternoon light. A railroad car, a place with walls and a roof and a door that locked, a place that sat still on a piece of track and didn't move. For someone who had spent 2 years in constant motion, the idea of a thing that stayed in one place felt almost unbearably appealing. The memories came without permission the way they always did. Her father, Wyatt Calloway, had been a quiet man. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but heavy, like something was always pressing down on him that he couldn't name. He'd driven a delivery truck for a company that moved auto parts up and down the Kanawha Valley gone before dawn and back after dark, tracking miles like they were the only currency that mattered. He'd speak maybe 20 words at dinner, answer questions with nods, and spend his evenings sitting on the steps of their trailer, smoking cigarettes and staring at Route 60 like he was waiting for something that never came. Nora had tried to talk to him when she was younger, before she learned that some silences can't be broken. She'd sit beside him on those steps and ask about his day, about the places he'd been, about anything that might get him to look at her instead of through her. But Wyatt Calloway's eyes were always somewhere else, looking back at something or ahead to something, but never right here, never right now, never at the daughter who wanted to know him. Her mother, Linda, had worked at a truck stop outside Charleston until her back gave out from carrying trays and her feet gave out from standing on them for 12-hour shifts. She'd been the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix, the kind that settled into your bones and became part of your architecture. But she'd smiled anyway, or tried to, and she'd told Nora that things would get better even when it was obvious they wouldn't. Linda died when Nora was 20. Heart failure, the doctor said, which was the medical way of saying that a lifetime of bad food and hard work and not enough rest had finally caught up. They buried her in the county cemetery with money borrowed from the truck stop owner, a man named Hal, who let them pay it back $20 at a time. Wyatt lasted 6 months after that. He wrapped his delivery truck around a bridge support on a rainy night in April, and the police said it looked like he'd just drifted into the concrete, like he'd fallen asleep or stopped paying attention or decided that the road ahead wasn't worth staying awake for. He was 65 years old. The trailer was repossessed 2 months later, Nora came home from a shift washing dishes to find a notice taped to the door. 3 days to vacate. She packed what she could into her backpack and left. The rest walked to the Greyhound station in Charleston with $38 in her pocket and no destination in mind. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of learning how to be nobody. 2 years of watching towns scroll past bus windows and wondering what it would feel like to stop. Not just stop moving, but stop being in between. To be somewhere instead of on the way to somewhere. To unpack a bag and leave it unpacked. She had never done that in her life. Not at the trailer. Not at any of the apartments before the trailer. Unpacking meant trusting that you'd be allowed to stay, and Nora had learned early that trust like that was a luxury she couldn't afford. But a railroad car for $10, 200 feet of track that belonged to nobody, a place that had sat still for decades and would sit still for decades more. When the bus pulled into Hinton, Nora got off. The county clerk's office was in a brick building that smelled like old paper and floor wax. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from her computer as Nora approached the counter. "Help you?" "I heard about a railroad car," Nora said. "For sale, in Talcott." The woman's fingers moved across the keyboard. Pullman Standard Sleeper Car, built 1946, decommissioned 1978. Currently located on an abandoned spur track approximately 2 miles east of Talcott, Summers County. Sold as is, minimum bid $10. She looked up at Nora and there was something in her eyes that wasn't pity exactly, but a kind of careful attention. The look of someone who had seen a lot of hopeful people make a lot of questionable decisions. "It's been listed for 8 months, she said. "No bidders. You interested?" Nora set the 2 $5 bills on the counter. The woman studied her for a moment. "You know there's no road access to that spur, right? It's about a mile walk from the nearest paved road. No electric, no water, no nothing." "I understand." The woman typed something, printed a form, and slid it across the counter. "Sign at the bottom." Nora signed her name in the space provided. Nora Calloway. It looked strange seeing it written out like that. Official. Like someone who owned something. The woman stamped the form and handed her a copy. "Track's all yours. Good luck." Nora walked out into the September sunlight feeling like gravity had changed somehow. Like the ground under her feet wasn't quite the same ground she'd been standing on 10 minutes ago. She walked to Talcott that afternoon. It took about 90 minutes from Hinton, following Route 3 along the New River, which ran wide and green through the valley between steep wooded hills. The road was quiet. A few trucks passed. A man on a tractor waved from a field. The air smelled like river water and warm pine and the faint metallic tang of old railroad iron. Nora stopped halfway across the bridge over the New River and looked down. The water was deep and clear and moving fast, dark green in the shadows and bright silver where it caught the sun. She could see rocks on the bottom round and smooth, polished by 1,000 years of current. The bridge vibrated faintly under her feet from the water's force. She stood there for a few minutes, watching the river, feeling the bridge hum beneath her. There was something steadying about it. The river had been here before her and would be here after her, and it didn't care about any of the things she was worried about. It just kept going the way water does, the way time does, indifferent and eternal. Talcott was barely a town, a post office, a church with white clapboard siding and a steeple that needed paint, a volunteer fire department housed in a cinder block building, a handful of houses spread along the road, their yards marked by chain-link fences and pickup trucks and satellite dishes. A historical marker at the edge of town mentioned something about John Henry and the Big Bend Tunnel, the legendary steel-driving man who had raced a steam drill through the mountain and won, and then died with his hammer in his hand. Nora didn't stop to read the whole thing. She was looking for the spur track. She found it about a mile past town, where a gravel road turned off the main highway and wound through a stand of hickory and red oak before ending at a rusty gate. The gate had a chain on it, but the chain was loose and the lock was broken, hanging open like a mouth. Beyond the gate, a narrow dirt path followed the old rail bed into the woods. The rails were still there, half buried in dirt and leaves, the ties rotting but holding their shape. Mushrooms grew along the edges of the ties. Ferns uncurled from between the rails. The path was so overgrown that in places Nora had to push through branches that had grown across it, leaves brushing against her arms and face catching in her hair. She followed the path for about 10 minutes. The woods were thick on both sides, the canopy so dense that the afternoon light came through in green-gold shafts that shifted and swayed as the breeze moved the branches. Birds called in the upper branches. A squirrel ran along a fallen log and disappeared into a hollow. The air was cool under the trees, 10 degrees cooler than the road, and it smelled like moss and leaf mold, and something sweet she thought might be wild grape. Then she saw it. The railroad car sat on the last 200 feet of track, which ended at a rusted bumper stop overgrown with kudzu. It was longer than she'd imagined, about 80 feet, a heavyweight Pullman sleeper, with a rounded roof and riveted steel sides. The paint had once been dark green, the color of old money, but most of it had faded and peeled away, leaving patches of rust and bare metal that looked like scars. The windows ran in a long row down both sides, most of them intact, but clouded with decades of grime. At one end, a narrow vestibule door hung slightly open, its steps folded down into the weeds. Nora stood on the path and looked at it. The car sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees on 3 sides. The late afternoon light came through the canopy in long slanted beams, catching the dust and pollen in the air. The car was enormous and still and silent. It looked like something from another century, which it was. It looked like something that had been waiting. She walked through the weeds to the vestibule and climbed the narrow steps. The door was heavy, but it moved when she pushed. She stepped inside. The interior was dim and narrow, a long corridor running the length of the car. On either side, compartments opened off the corridor, each one containing a bench seat that would have folded down into a sleeping berth. The upholstery was faded and torn, the fabric rotting in places, but the frames were solid. The walls were paneled in dark wood, mahogany or walnut, dulled by grime but not damaged. The floor was carpeted, the carpet worn to threads in the corridor, but still intact in the compartments. The ceiling was arched, lined with more wood paneling and small brass light fixtures that had turned green with tarnish. It smelled like old wood and dust and something faintly metallic. The kind of smell that buildings get when they've been sealed up for a very long time. The air was still and cool, 20 degrees cooler than outside. Nora walked the corridor, slowly looking into each compartment. There were 12 sleeping sections in all 6 on each side. At the far end of the car, past the last compartment, was a narrow door with a brass handle. She tried it. It was locked. She looked at the handle more carefully. It was different from the other doors in the car, heavier, commercial grade. The door itself was steel, not wood, and it was set into a steel frame that had been welded to the car's structure. It wasn't original to the car. Someone had added it later, reinforced it, made it permanent. Nora pulled at the handle again. The lock was a deadbolt old, but solid. She didn't have a key. She went back outside and walked around to the end of the car, looking for another way in. There was a window, small and high up, but it was sealed shut and covered from the inside with something dark that blocked the light. She stood there in the weeds, staring up at that window, and felt something shift inside her chest. A locked door at the end of a railroad car that nobody had wanted for 8 months. A room that someone had gone to considerable trouble to seal off and hide. She went back inside and examined the door more carefully. The hinges were on the outside, heavy-duty industrial hinges that had been painted over, but were still accessible. The pins were visible. Nora found a piece of rebar in the weeds outside the car, brought it back inside, and used it to tap out the hinge pins one at a time. She worked carefully, methodically, the way her mother had taught her to approach any task that mattered. First the bottom pin, then the middle, then the top. It took almost an hour. The pins were tight, rusted into place by decades of weather and neglect. When the last pin came free, she pulled the door away from the frame and leaned it against the corridor wall. Behind the door was a room she hadn't expected. It was the rear section of the car, about 15 feet long, completely enclosed. The windows had been covered with steel plates welded to the frame from the inside, which is why they'd been dark from outside. The room was lit only by the light coming through the open doorway behind her. And it was full. Wooden shelves ran along both walls, floor to ceiling, constructed from rough-cut lumber that looked like it had been salvaged from railroad ties. On the shelves, arranged in neat rows, were cigar boxes, dozens of them, maybe 100. Each one was a different brand, a different color, a different size, but they were all stacked carefully, labels facing out, organized with obvious care. Nora stood in the doorway and stared. She picked up the nearest box and opened it. Inside were tightly rolled bundles of paper money, held together with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age. 20s mostly, some 50s. She opened another box. More money. Another. This one held coins, old silver dollars, heavy and smooth. Another held folded stock certificates. Another held gold coins in small felt pouches. She sat down on the floor. The light from the doorway fell across the shelves in a warm rectangle. Cigar boxes everywhere she looked, stretching from one end of the hidden room to the other. stacked with the precision of someone who had done this over and over, who had made it a ritual, a discipline, a faith. She counted for 3 hours. She sat on the floor of that sealed steel room and opened every box one by one and counted what was inside. Some boxes held a few $100s. Some held thousands. The coins were old silver and gold, and even without knowing their exact value, she could tell they were worth more than their face value. Much more. The total in paper currency came to $38,400. The coins and gold she couldn't value precisely, but she knew they had to be worth at least another 10 or 15,000. The stock certificates were from companies that no longer existed, worthless as investments, interesting as artifacts. At the bottom of the last shelf, tucked behind a row of cigar boxes, she found a metal lunchbox, the old-fashioned kind with a rounded top and a clasp. The kind men used to carry to work in factories and on construction sites and in railroad yards. Nora opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a black and white photograph. The photograph showed a man standing beside the railroad car. He was in his 60s, lean and weathered, wearing overalls and a railroad cap. His face was lined and sun-darkened, the face of someone who had spent a lifetime outside. Behind him, the car was freshly painted, the dark green sharp and clean, the windows clear. He was smiling slightly, one hand resting on the side of the car like he was leaning on something he trusted. The letter was handwritten on lined paper in blocky, careful capitals. My name is Granville Calloway. I worked for the C&O Railroad for 32 years. Brakeman, then conductor, then yard supervisor. When the line shut down in '78, I bought this car with my severance pay. $50. They were glad to get rid of it. I have been saving money in this car since 1978. I do not trust banks. My father lost everything in 1933, and I never forgot it. This money is what I earned and saved honest. If anyone from my family finds this, they should know I never forgot about them. I had a son named Wyatt who left home in 1972. I do not know where he went. If he has children, they are my blood, and this belongs to them. Granville Calloway, Talcott, West Virginia, March 1998. Nora read the letter 3 times. Then she turned it over and read it again, looking for something she might have missed, some detail that would make it mean something different than what it clearly meant. Wyatt Calloway. Her father's name was Wyatt. Wyatt Calloway. He had left when he was young and never talked about where he came from. He had driven a delivery truck and lived in a trailer park, and never once mentioned a father or a railroad or a town called Talcott. Granville Calloway was her grandfather. She sat in the dark, sealed room at the end of a rusted railroad car in the hills of West Virginia and cried. Not quietly, not politely, but the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it was there until something broke it open. The kind that shakes your whole body and doesn't care who hears. She cried for the grandfather she had never met, for the father who had left home at 17 and never looked back, for the mother who had worked herself to death for the trailer on Route 60, and the county cemetery and the Greyhound stations and all the places she had been that were never home. And she cried because Granville Calloway, a man she had never known existed until 5 minutes ago, had spent 20 years putting money into cigar boxes in a railroad car for someone he wasn't sure would ever come. He had hoped. He had waited. He had written a letter and put it in a lunchbox and tucked it behind the last row of boxes on the bottom shelf. And then he had died. And the car had sat here in the woods for another 21 years, silent and sealed, and full of everything he had saved. The sun was setting by the time she walked back out of the woods. The sky over the ridgeline was orange and purple, the light fading fast, the way it does in the mountains. She stood at the gate and looked back down the path toward the railroad car, but she couldn't see it from here. It was hidden in the trees, invisible unless you knew where to look. She had entered the woods that afternoon as a homeless person with a backpack and $10. She was leaving as someone with $52,000 in a railroad car and a grandfather's letter in her pocket, and a last name that suddenly meant something it hadn't meant before. Everything had changed. The air, the light, the way the ground felt under her feet. She had spent 2 years learning how to be invisible, how to take up no space, how to need nothing from anyone. And now she had this, a place, a past, a man who had saved for her before she was born, who had believed she would come even when he had no reason to believe it. She walked back toward Hinton as the last light drained from the sky. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars. The river made its sound the eternal sound of water over rock. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew long and lonesome, calling across the valley. Nora Calloway walked with her hands in her pockets and her backpack on her shoulders, and her grandfather's letter folded against her heart. And for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't thinking about where she would sleep tonight. She was thinking about what came next. She was thinking about wood and water and electric and all the things you need to make a railroad car into a home. She was thinking about her father, who had left this place when he was 17 and spent the rest of his life not talking about it. She was thinking about her grandfather, who had worked 32 years for a railroad and then bought a piece of it when they were done with him. She was thinking about the fact that some things can be lost for a very long time and still be found. That some distances can be crossed even after the people who made them are gone. That inheritance isn't just what gets passed down, but what gets left behind for someone to discover. The next morning, Nora walked into the First National Bank of Hinton, carrying a backpack full of money. The teller counted it twice, slow and careful, her fingers moving through the bills with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled a lot of cash, but never quite this much from someone who looked quite like this. $38,400. Nora opened a savings account and a checking account. She walked out into the September sunlight, feeling like she was wearing someone else's shoes, like she had stepped into a life that didn't quite fit yet, but might given time. She bought a truck that afternoon, a 2001 Ford F-150 with a camper shell bought for $3,400 from a man in Hinton, who was selling it because his knees had gotten too bad to climb in and out. It had 152,000 miles on it, and a tape deck in the dashboard that still worked, and a smell like old coffee and motor oil that Nora found oddly comforting. She drove it back to the gravel road near Talcott and parked it at the gate. For the first 2 weeks, she lived in the truck. She slept in the camper shell on a sleeping bag she bought at a sporting goods store, and she drove into Hinton each morning for supplies, and then she walked the path to the railroad car to work. The first thing she did was open the car up. She pried open the sealed windows one at a time, pulling off the steel plates from the inside with a pry bar she bought at the hardware store. She let light into the hidden room for the first time in decades. Sunlight poured through the windows and showed her things she hadn't seen in the dark. Dust motes swirling, cobwebs in the corners, the grain of the wood on the shelves. The way the cigar boxes looked in natural light, their colors faded but still distinct, their labels readable. She opened every window in the corridor. She propped the vestibule doors open at both ends and let the mountain air blow through the length of the car, clearing out the stale air and the dust and the smell of 46 years of silence. She cleaned the interior over the next 10 days. She swept the corridor and the compartments with a broom she bought in town. She pulled up the rotted carpet and found hardwood flooring underneath tongue and groove oak that was dirty but undamaged, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. She scrubbed the mahogany wall panels with Murphy oil soap and soft cloths, working one section at a time, watching the dark wood come back to life under her hands. The grain appeared like something rising to the surface of deep water, beautiful and intricate and patient. The brass light fixtures she removed one by one and soaked in vinegar and salt until the green tarnish dissolved and the brass glowed warm and gold. She hung them back up and stood in the corridor looking at them, these small, perfect things that her grandfather had looked at every day, that had lit his way through this car for 25 years. At night, she sat in the truck and wrote lists, things she would need, things she would have to learn: insulation, plumbing, electrical, wood stove installation, water sourcing. The lists got longer every night. The tasks seemed impossible. She had never built anything in her life. She had never fixed anything more complicated than a bicycle chain. She knew nothing about construction or carpentry or any of the skills that would be required to turn this rusted shell into a place where a human being could live. But she also knew that her grandfather had done it. Granville Calloway had bought this car for $50 and made it into a home. He had lived here for 25 years. He had saved $52,000 one cigar box at a time. If he could do that, she could learn to do this. On the 15th day, an old man appeared at the gate. He was tall and lean, maybe 68 or 70, with white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains around them. He wore work boots and jeans and a canvas jacket, and he stood at the gate with his hands in his pockets, watching Nora carry a bucket of soapy water out of the railroad car. She stopped when she saw him. They looked at each other across the clearing. "You're living in Gran's car," he said. It wasn't a question. "You knew him?" Nora asked. "Worked with him for 30 years. Name's Boone Garrett." He didn't move closer, just stood there, at the gate, studying her the way you'd study a puzzle you weren't sure you wanted to solve. "You family?" he asked. "His granddaughter." Boone Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the railroad car, at the open windows and the doors propped wide at the signs of cleaning and care. "Gran died in 2003, he said. "Nobody knew about this place. Nobody came looking. Nobody knew to look," Nora said. Another long silence. A crow called from the trees. The wind moved through the leaves with a sound like water. "You planning to stay?" Boone asked. "I am. This car needs a lot of work. You know anything about construction?" "No." "Plumbing?" "No." "Electrical?" "No." Boone Garrett almost smiled. Almost. "You got money some." "Money's not enough," he said. "You want this place, you're gonna have to earn it. Build it right or don't build it at all." That's what Gran would say. He turned to leave, and Nora felt something like panic rising in her chest. This man had known her grandfather. This man had worked beside him for 30 years. This man was walking away, and she didn't know if he would come back. "Will you help me?" she asked. Boone stopped. He didn't turn around, but he stopped. "I'll think about it," he said. And then he walked back down the gravel road and disappeared into the trees, and Nora stood there with a bucket of soapy water in her hands and her grandfather's railroad car at her back, wondering if she had just met the only person in Talcott who remembered Granville Calloway, or if she had just met the person who was going to teach her how to become worthy of what he had left behind. The sun was setting again the way it did every day, indifferent to hope or fear, or the small human struggles playing out in the shadow of these ancient mountains. But Nora Calloway didn't feel small anymore. She felt connected to something larger than herself. She felt like a link in a chain that stretched backward into time and forward into possibility. She carried the bucket back into the railroad car and got back to work. Boone Garrett came back 3 days later. Nora was on her knees in one of the sleeping compartments, prying up the last section of rotted carpet when she heard boots on the vestibule steps. She looked up to see him standing in the corridor, a canvas tool bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. "You still here?" he said. "I'm still here." He looked around the car, taking in the work she'd done. The windows cleaned, the brass fixtures polished, the floors swept bare. His eyes lingered on the compartment where she'd stacked the cigar boxes arranged on a shelf the way Gran had arranged them, labels facing out. "You kept them," he said. "They're part of it." Boone set his tool bag down and unscrewed his thermos. The smell of coffee filled the corridor, strong and bitter. He took a sip and looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Gran bought this car in 1978, he said, day after the railroad shut down the Talcott yard. They auctioned off everything. Rolling stock tools, office furniture. Most of us just wanted to get out of there, take our severance and forget we'd ever worked for the C&O. But Gran walked up to this car and put his hand on it like he was checking a horse for soundness. Then he bid $50 and nobody else bid against him." Nora sat back on her heels and listened. He lived in it from that day until the day he died. 25 years. He ran a water line from a spring up the hill, rigged up a wood stove, built shelves and bunks, made it livable. People thought he was crazy living in a train car in the woods, but Gran didn't care what people thought. He cared about doing things right. Boone took another sip of coffee. You want to stay here, you need to understand something. This car was Gran's pride. He kept it perfect. Every board tight, every seal weatherproof, every system working. He didn't cut corners, and he didn't do things halfway. If you're going to live here, you do it his way, or you don't do it at all. I don't know his way, Nora said. I don't know any way. Then you better learn. He set down his thermos and opened his tool bag. First thing is insulation. Cars built out of steel, which means it's an oven in summer and a freezer in winter. Gran used rigid foam board on the walls and ceiling. We're going to do the same. That was how it started. Boone showed up every morning at 7. He didn't ask if Nora was ready or if she wanted help. He just arrived with his tools and his thermos and started working, and if she wanted to learn, she could keep up. He taught her how to measure twice and cut once. How to fit foam board into the curved spaces between the steel ribs of the car's interior, cutting each piece precisely so it wedged tight without gaps. How to use construction adhesive that set fast and held forever. How to think 3 steps ahead, to see how one piece would affect the next piece, and the piece after that. It was hard work, harder than anything Nora had ever done. Her hands cramped from gripping tools. Her shoulders ached from holding boards over her head. Her knees hurt from kneeling on the oak floor. But Boone never slowed down, never offered sympathy, never suggested she take a break. Gran worked 12-hour shifts in the rail yard, he said when she asked for water. In August, heat, and January, cold. You want to live in his house, you work like he worked? So she did. They insulated the walls first, then the ceiling. It took 2 weeks. When they were done, Boone stepped back and looked at the work with the critical eye of a man who had spent his life making sure trains ran on time and cargo arrived intact. Good, he said. That was all. Just good. But Nora felt something warm spread through her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, maybe, or the beginning of it. Next came the interior paneling. Thin sheets of plywood that Boone had already stained to match the original mahogany. They mounted them over the insulation with finish nails working section by section, compartment by compartment. The car started to look like something again. Not new, but restored. Intentional. The insulation changed everything. The steel shell that had been freezing cold at night and burning hot in the afternoon became stable quiet, protected. The drafts stopped. The condensation stopped. The car felt like a building instead of a vehicle, like something meant for human habitation instead of motion. October slipped into November. The leaves fell from the hickories and oaks, leaving the woods bare and gray. The air turned cold. Frost appeared on the windows in the morning, delicate patterns that melted when the sun hit them. Nora could see her breath inside the car when she woke up in the truck, and her hands were stiff when she started working. Boone noticed but said nothing. He just brought an extra thermos of coffee and poured her a cup without asking if she wanted it. They moved on to plumbing. Gran ran his line from a spring about 400 yards uphill, Boone said, pointing through the trees to the northwest. Fed a tank he mounted on a platform beside the car. Gravity does the work. No pump needed. They hiked up through the woods to find the spring. It came out of a limestone ledge beneath a stand of hemlocks, clear and cold, flowing into a small pool ringed with moss. Boone knelt and cupped his hand in the water. Drank, nodded. Still strong, still clean. They spent 5 days digging a trench from the spring to the car-burying PVC pipe below the frost line. Nora's hands blistered from the shovel. Her back screamed. But she kept digging because Boone kept digging, and because somewhere in the back of her mind was the image of her grandfather doing this same work 46 years ago, alone, without help, without anyone to tell him he was doing it right. They built a platform beside the car from pressure-treated lumber and mounted a 300-gallon tank on top. Ran lines into the car, installed a sink in what would become the kitchen, roughed in plumbing for a small bathroom. Boone showed her how to solder copper pipe, how to tighten fittings until they were snug but not stripped, how to test for leaks. "Water's the most important thing," he said. "You can live without electric. You can live without heat if you have to. But you can't live without water." Gran knew that. He got this right first before anything else. November became December. The cold deepened. Snow fell one night, light and dry, dusting the railroad car and the trees and the rails with white. Nora woke in the truck to a world transformed, silent and clean, and for a moment she forgot about the work ahead and just looked at it. The beauty of it. The way the snow made everything simple. But the work didn't stop. They tackled electrical next. Boone brought a small generator that ran on propane, set it up on a concrete pad they poured behind the car, ran conduit through the walls, pulled wire, installed junction boxes and outlets and switches. He taught her the code, the colors, the way current flowed, and why it mattered that you got it right. "Electricity can kill you if you're careless," he said. "Respect it. Fear it a little. But don't be afraid to use it." Later, they would add solar panels. 4 of them mounted on a rack beside the car with a battery bank in a weatherproof box underneath. But for now, the generator was enough. Lights that worked. A way to charge her phone. A small refrigerator they installed in the kitchen area. The car was becoming something. Not finished, but possible. Nora could see it now, the shape of what it would be. A bedroom in the rear compartment. A kitchen in the middle sections. A living area up front with the wood stove. Small but complete. Functional. Hers. She was working on the kitchen counter one afternoon in mid-December when Boone spoke from behind her. "You know why Gran saved all that money?" Nora turned. Boone was standing in the corridor, his hands in his pockets, looking at something she couldn't see. "He told me once," Boone continued. "Said his father lost everything in the Depression. Bank failure, 1933. Wiped out. They were farming people, had some land, some savings, all of it gone overnight. His father never recovered, died broke and bitter in 1941. Gran was 13 years old, and he swore he'd never trust a bank again, never put his faith in anything he couldn't see and touch and count with his own hands. He pulled out his thermos, took a drink. So he saved it himself. Every dollar he made that he didn't need to spend, he put in a cigar box. Started in 1978 and never stopped. By the time he died, he had more money in this car than most people have in their retirement accounts. And nobody knew. Nobody even suspected. Did he have friends? Nora asked. People he talked to. Gran didn't talk much. He was friendly enough, but private. He'd come into town every Saturday, buy groceries, have coffee at the general store. People liked him, but nobody really knew him. That's how he wanted it. Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had a son. Nora's hands stilled on the counter. Wyatt, good kid from what I remember. Smart, curious, always asking questions about how things worked. Gran raised him alone after his wife died. Cancer back in '65. Wyatt was 10 years old. The math clicked into place in Nora's head. Her father had been 10 when his mother died, the same age Nora had been when she first realized her family was different from other families, that other kids had fathers who smiled and mothers who didn't work themselves to exhaustion. What happened? She asked. They had a falling out. Wyatt was 17, wanted to leave, see something besides Talcott and railroad tracks. Gran wanted him to stay work the railroad like he had. They fought about it, said things they didn't mean the way people do. And Wyatt left, just packed a bag one night and walked out. Gran came to work the next morning and didn't say a word about it, but you could see it in his eyes. Something broken that wasn't gonna heal. Boone turned and looked directly at Nora. Gran waited for Wyatt to come back. Every day for the rest of his life he waited. Kept the car ready, kept money saved, kept hoping. But Wyatt never came. He couldn't, Nora said quietly. My father died in 2020. Car accident. Boone's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. I'm sorry. Did Gran know? Did he know Wyatt had a family? I don't know. He never said, but I think he hoped. They worked in silence for a while after that. The only sounds were the rasp of sandpaper on wood and the distant call of a crow and the wind moving through the bare branches outside. That night, Nora sat in the truck and thought about her father, Wyatt Calloway, who had driven a delivery truck and lived in a trailer, and never once mentioned that he'd grown up in a railroad car in the woods of West Virginia, who had left at 17 and never looked back, never made peace, never came home. What had the fight been about? What words had been said that couldn't be unsaid? What kind of pride or fear or anger made a son walk away from his father, and a father let his son go? She thought about the letter in the lunchbox, the careful capitals. If he has children, they are my blood. Gran had known it was possible. He had saved for people he'd never met. on the chance that someday, somehow, they would find their way here. And she had. Against all odds, against all logic, she had spent her last $10 on a railroad car and found a grandfather she never knew existed. Found a home in the place her father had run from. Found everything her father had left behind. December deepened into the hardest cold Nora had ever experienced. The temperatures dropped to 10 degrees, then 5, then 0. The wind came howling down from the ridges, shaking the trees and rattling the windows of the railroad car. Ice formed on the inside of the glass. The ground froze solid. Nora moved into the car, even though it wasn't finished. She couldn't take another night in the truck. Couldn't take the cold that seeped through the camper shell and turned her sleeping bag into a cocoon of insufficient warmth. She set up a cot in one of the rear compartments, brought in her sleeping bag, and all the blankets she owned, and tried to sleep while the steel shell around her ticked and creaked in the freezing air. It was brutal, but she kept working. She had to. Stopping meant giving up. And giving up meant admitting that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't strong enough, that her grandfather's faith in the family he'd never met had been misplaced. Boone showed her how to install the wood stove. They cut a hole in the roof for the chimney pipe, sealed it with flashing and high-temperature silicone, ran the pipe up through the ceiling and out into the December sky. The stove itself was a small cast-iron unit designed for heating small spaces efficiently. Boone had found it at an estate sale in Hinton. Gran had one just like it, he said. Kept this whole car warm on a handful of wood. They fired it up for the first time on a night when the temperature was supposed to drop below 0. Nora fed small pieces of kindling into the firebox, watched the flames catch and grow, felt the heat start to radiate out into the car. Within an hour, the temperature had risen 20 degrees. Within 2 hours, she could take off her jacket. Within 3, the car felt like a living space instead of a steel coffin. She slept that night in actual warmth, and it felt like a luxury she'd forgotten existed. But the cold wasn't done with her yet. It happened on a night in late December, 2 days after Christmas, when the temperature plummeted to -10 and stayed there. Nora woke to a sound like gunfire, sharp cracks echoing through the car. She sat up in the darkness, confused and afraid. And then she heard it again. Crack. Crack, crack. She grabbed her flashlight and ran to the kitchen area. And that's when she saw it. Water was pouring from the ceiling. Not dripping. Pouring. A steady stream that had already soaked the floor and was spreading fast, pooling around the base of the cabinets she'd just installed, running under the wood stove, seeping into every crack and crevice. The pipes had frozen and burst. Nora stood there in her socks and long underwear, shining her flashlight at the water cascading from the ceiling, and felt something inside her break. 3 weeks of work. 3 weeks of learning to solder pipe and tighten fittings and test for leaks. 3 weeks of Boone teaching her and her getting it right, getting it perfect, making Gran proud. Gone. Destroyed. Ruined by cold she couldn't control and physics she didn't understand well enough to prevent. She turned off the main water valve, but the damage was done. The water in the pipes had frozen, expanded, split the copper in a dozen places. It would all have to be torn out and replaced. All of it. Nora sat down on the wet floor and put her head in her hands. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry, too cold and too defeated, and too aware of how impossible this all was. She was 22 years old with no training and no experience trying to turn a rusted railroad car into a home in the middle of a West Virginia winter. And she was failing. The car was beating her. The cold was beating her. Reality was beating her. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe this was insane. Maybe she should take what was left of the money and leave, find an apartment somewhere warm. Get a regular job. Live a regular life. Maybe trying to honor her grandfather's memory by living in his railroad car was just another kind of running away. Just another way of avoiding the real world and the real work of building an actual future. She sat there until the sun came up, watching the water slowly stop dripping, watching the puddles begin to freeze on the floor. When Boone arrived at 7, he found her still sitting there, surrounded by ice. He took one look at the burst pipes and the frozen floor, and Nora's face, and he set down his thermos very carefully. "You want to quit?" he asked. "I don't know." Gran rebuilt the plumbing in this car 3 times. First time, the pipes froze just like this. Second time, a coupling failed and flooded everything. Third time, he got it right. Took him 4 years to get it right. Nora looked up at him. 4 years. He didn't expect it to be easy. He expected it to be hard. But he also expected himself to finish what he started. Boone picked up his thermos and unscrewed the cap. Took a long drink. "You're not Gran. You're not a railroad man with 32 years of experience fixing things that break. You're a kid who bought a train car with her last $10 and doesn't know what she's doing. So yeah, it's gonna be harder for you. It's gonna take longer. You're gonna make mistakes Gran wouldn't have made." He looked at her with eyes that had seen a lot of failures and a lot of people who quit. "But you're his blood. That means something. Means you've got the same stubbornness, the same refusal to accept that some things are impossible. So you can quit if you want. Nobody would blame you. Or you can get up and we can tear out these pipes and start over and do it better this time." Nora sat there for another moment. Then she stood up. "Let's do it better," she said. They spent the next week tearing out the ruined plumbing, cutting away the burst sections, pulling out the damaged pipe, exposing the work they'd done, and undoing it piece by piece. It hurt in a way that had nothing to do with cold hands or sore muscles. It hurt because every piece they removed represented hours of learning, hours of getting it right, hours of progress that was now just scrap metal headed for the dump. But they didn't stop. They worked through New Year's, through the first week of January, through cold that seemed determined to prove that human beings had no business living in steel boxes in the woods. And slowly, pipe by pipe, joint by joint, they rebuilt it. This time, Boone showed her how to insulate the pipes with foam sleeves, how to run heat tape along sections that were most vulnerable to freezing, how to slope the lines slightly so they could be drained if necessary, how to install shut-off valves at strategic points so that one failure wouldn't destroy everything. You learn more from fixing your mistakes than you do from getting it right the first time, Boone said. Gran taught me that. By mid-January, the new plumbing was in and tested. Nora turned on the water and watched it flow from the kitchen tap clear and cold and clean, and felt a surge of something that might have been joy, if joy hadn't been buried under so many layers of exhaustion. They moved on to the sleeping compartments, tearing out the old rotted berths, rebuilding them with pine lumber and new upholstery foam wrapped in canvas. Each compartment became a small, self-contained room, just wide enough for a bed and a narrow shelf. Nora kept the compartment closest to the rear of the car for herself, the one where the window looked out into the trees. She hung a curtain across the doorway for privacy, put a reading lamp on the shelf, lay down on the new berth that first night, and listened to the sounds of the West Virginia woods filtering through the window. Crickets had gone silent for winter, but there were other sounds. The wind, a distant owl, the faint metallic tick of the car's steel frame cooling in the night air, the creak of the springs beneath her settling into a shape that fit. It felt like home. Not quite finished, but close. Close enough that she could imagine it. Close enough that she could see herself living here, not just for weeks or months, but for years. Growing old in this car the way Gran had grown old. Watching the seasons change through these windows. Becoming part of Talcott the way he had been part of it. In February, on a morning when the sun came through the windows and made everything look possible again, Boone showed up with a manila envelope. Found this going through some old papers, he said, handing it to her. The envelope was addressed in careful handwriting to Wyatt Calloway with an address in Charleston that Nora recognized. The trailer park on Route 60. The place where she'd grown up. The envelope had never been opened. It had never been sent. Gran gave this to me in 1999, Boone said quietly. Asked me to mail it. I told him I would, but I couldn't find the exact address. The trailer park was big, and I didn't know which unit, and there was no phone number, and I kept meaning to drive down there and look, but I never did. And then time passed, and it seemed like maybe it was better to let it be. Let Gran keep his pride. Not force a reunion that maybe Wyatt didn't want. He looked at Nora with something in his eyes that might have been regret. I was wrong. I should have tried harder. Nora took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. She could feel something inside. Paper. A letter. I'll leave you alone, Boone said, and he walked out of the car before she could respond. Nora sat down in the compartment she'd claimed as her bedroom and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, covered in the same blocky capitals she'd seen in the lunchbox. Wyatt, I was wrong. I wanted you to be strong, but I made you feel small. I wanted you to stay, but I gave you reasons to leave. I am sorry. The rail car is yours if you want it. All of it. The money, the work, everything. It was always meant for you. Come home if you can. If you can't, I understand. But know that I never stopped being your father. And you never stopped being my son. Dad, May, 1999. Nora read it 3 times. Then she sat there with the letter in her lap and the morning sun falling through the window, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking this time, opening. Her grandfather had written this letter 26 years ago, had asked Boone to send it, had waited for a response that never came because the letter never arrived. And her father, Wyatt, who had lived 40 miles away with a daughter and a job, and a life that could have included this place, this history, this reconciliation, never knew. Never knew that his father had reached out. Never knew that the door was open. Never knew that he could come home. 26 years of waiting. 26 years of two stubborn men living close enough to see each other, but too proud, or too afraid, or too wounded to try. And now, they were both gone. Gran dead in 2003. Wyatt dead in 2020. Both of them taking their pride to the grave. Both of them dying without ever speaking the words that needed to be spoken. Nora stood up and walked to the front of the car. Boone was standing outside leaning against the F-150 drinking coffee and looking at something in the distance. She walked up to him and stopped. "You should have sent it," she said. "I know. My father lived 40 miles away. He could have come. He could have brought me. We could have known Gran. We could have had this." "I know," Boone said again, and there was pain in his voice that was real and deep. "I think about it every day. Have for 25 years. But I can't change it. Can't go back. Can only tell you I'm sorry and know that sorry doesn't fix anything." Nora wanted to be angry. Wanted to rage at him for the lost years, the lost connection, the lost chance for her father to make peace with his father before they both ran out of time. But standing there in the February sunlight looking at this old man who had worked beside her grandfather for 30 years and who had shown up every morning to teach her how to build something she didn't know. How to build, she couldn't find the anger. What she found instead was understanding. The bitter understanding that people make mistakes. That good intentions don't always produce good outcomes. That sometimes the things we don't do matter as much as the things we do. And there's no way to go back and fix them. We just have to live with them and try to do better next time. "I'm gonna finish this car," she said. "Not for the money, not even for myself. For Gran, and for my father. For all the years they lost because they were too proud to bend. I'm gonna build this right. And I'm going to live here. And I'm going to prove that their story doesn't have to end the way it ended. That some things can be fixed, even after the people who broke them are gone." Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once sharp and final. "Then let's get back to work," he said. They worked through February and into March. The days got longer. The cold began to ease, though the nights were still freezing. They finished the kitchen, installing a 2-burner propane stove and a counter made from a slab of cherry wood that a logger in Talcott gave Nora after she helped him patch a fence. They finished the bathroom, a tiny space carved out of one sleeping compartment with a sink and a composting toilet, and a shower that ran on a gravity-fed system from the water tank outside. They finished the living area, installing the wood stove in the forward section, with 2 armchairs Nora found at a yard sale in Hinton. She built a bookshelf from old railroad ties that Boone helped her cut and sand, and she arranged Gran's cigar boxes on a shelf above the kitchen counter, labels out the way he had kept them. Some she filled with tea bags and matches and small tools. Some she left empty as a reminder that a container didn't have to be full to have value. Sometimes the empty ones held the most important thing of all, which was space for whatever came next. By the end of March, the railroad car was complete. Not perfect. There were gaps in the trim where she'd cut wrong. There were paint drips on the floor where she'd been careless. There were 100 small imperfections that a professional would have avoided, but that Nora had created through ignorance and inexperience and the simple fact that she was learning as she went. But it was done. It was warm and dry and functional, and hers. It was a home. Boone came by on the last day of March with his thermos and his tool bag, and he walked through the car, slowly looking at everything they'd built. He ran his hand along the kitchen counter, opened the wood stove door and looked inside, tested the water at the sink, sat in one of the armchairs and looked around the living area with eyes that saw not what was there, but what had been there before when Gran was alive. And the car was his sanctuary. He'd be proud, Boone said finally. You think so? I know so. This is good work, honest work, the kind that lasts. He stood up and picked up his tool bag. You don't need me anymore. You know how to fix things now, how to maintain what you've built, how to solve problems when they come up. And they will come up. Something always breaks, but you'll handle it. Thank you, Nora said, for everything, for teaching me, for showing up every morning, for not giving up on me when I wanted to give up on myself. Boone looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. I didn't do it for you, he said. I did it for Gran, because I owed him, because I didn't send that letter and I can't ever make that right. But maybe I could do this. Maybe I could help his granddaughter build the home he wanted his son to have. He walked to the vestibule door and stopped. But somewhere along the way it stopped being about making amends and started being about watching you become the kind of person Gran would recognize. Someone who doesn't quit. Someone who finishes what they start. Someone who earns what they have. He looked back at her one more time. Welcome home, Nora. And then he walked down the steps and across the clearing and disappeared into the trees. And Nora stood in the doorway of her grandfather's railroad car and watched him go. She didn't feel alone. She felt connected to something larger than herself, to a man she'd never met, but who had believed in her before she was born, to a father who had made mistakes, but who had tried in his own way to come back, to a friend who had taught her that fixing mistakes sometimes means building something new on top of them. That night, Nora sat on the vestibule steps and watched the sun set through the trees. The woods were starting to green up, dogwood buds swelling the first brave shoots of spring, pushing through the leaf litter. The air smelled like warming earth and possibility. She thought about Gran, who had worked 32 years for a railroad and then bought a piece of it when they were done with him. Who had lived in this car and saved money in cigar boxes and written letters to a son who never read them? She thought about her father who had left at 17 and spent the rest of his life not talking about where he came from, carrying his own regrets in silence, the way his father had carried his. And she thought about herself, 22 years old, and finally settled, finally somewhere, instead of on the way to somewhere. The railroad car behind her was warm with the heat from the wood stove. Inside were shelves and compartments and all the small necessary things that make a space into a home. The cigar boxes arranged just so. The letter in its frame on the wall. The photograph of Gran standing beside this same car when it was new and he was young and everything was still possible. Some inheritances are money. Some are objects. But the best ones are harder to name. They're lessons learned through difficulty. They're skills acquired through failure. They're the knowledge that you can take something broken and make it whole. Take something abandoned and give it purpose. Take something that everyone else has given up on and prove that it still has value. Gran had left her $52,000 and a railroad car and a letter written in careful capitals. But what he'd really left her was the chance to become someone who could earn it. Someone who could take what he'd built and build on it. Someone who could turn his unfinished story into something with an ending that mattered. Nora Calloway sat on the steps of her home and watched night fall over the West Virginia hills. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about where she would go tomorrow. She was thinking about what she would build next. April came to the West Virginia mountains the way it always did. Tentative at first, as if winter might change its mind and come roaring back. But slowly, day by day, the world turned green. Buds swelled on the dogwoods. Ferns uncurled from the forest floor. The spring that fed Nora's water system ran strong and cold, swollen with snowmelt from the higher elevations. She had been living in the railroad car for a month now, and the routines of daily life had settled into a pattern that felt almost normal. Wake at dawn when light came through the bedroom window. Start a fire in the wood stove to take the chill off. Make coffee on the propane burner. Sit on the vestibule steps with her mug and watch the morning light move through the trees. The work wasn't finished. Work like this was never finished. There were always small repairs to make improvements, to add systems to maintain. A loose board here, a dripping faucet there. The constant gathering of firewood, the monitoring of the water tank level, the checking of the solar panels for debris. But these were the tasks of living, not building. These were the rhythms of a home. Boone still came by, though less frequently now. Once a week, usually on Saturday mornings, he'd appear at the gate with his thermos, and they'd walk the property together, checking the water line, inspecting the roof, discussing what might need attention before next winter. He didn't teach anymore. He consulted. There was a difference, and Nora felt it. She had graduated from student to steward. The people of Talcott were beginning to notice her too. It started small. The postmistress, a woman named Ruth with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, mentioned at the general store that someone was living in old Gran Calloway's railroad car. A volunteer firefighter named Dale drove out one morning ostensibly to check for fire hazards, but really just to satisfy his curiosity. He found Nora splitting wood behind the car, her hands blistered and her face streaked with sweat. And he stood there watching her work with the quiet appraisal of someone who understood that labor told you more about a person than words ever could. "You're doing all right," he said when she stopped to rest. "Trying to." Gran would appreciate that. The trying. Word spread the way it does in a town of 300 people, quickly and with embellishment. By the end of April, most of Talcott knew the story or a version of it. Gran Calloway's granddaughter had come home. The girl nobody knew existed had found the railroad car nobody knew was inhabited, and the money nobody knew was saved. She was living there now alone, making a go of it. Some people were skeptical. Some thought she was foolish. But most reserved judgment because in a place like Talcott, you earned your place through persistence, not proclamation. You showed up. You stayed. You did the work. And if you were still there when the seasons changed, then maybe you belonged. Nora didn't seek out the town. She wasn't ready for that yet. She drove to Hinton for supplies kept to herself, focused on the endless small tasks that filled her days. But she was aware of the attention, in the way you're aware of eyes on you in a crowded room. Not hostile, but watchful, waiting to see what she would do next. In early May, she decided to clean out the storage compartment above the main corridor. It was accessible through a hatch in the ceiling, and she'd been putting it off because it required a ladder and looked like it was full of things that had been deliberately stored and forgotten. She climbed up with a flashlight and found exactly that. Boxes of old railroad paperwork, spare parts for equipment that probably didn't exist anymore, a canvas tarp that mice had turned into a nest, and in the far corner, wrapped in a plastic bag that had kept it dry through decades of temperature change, a small wooden box with brass hinges. Nora pulled it out and climbed back down. The box wasn't locked. She opened it sitting on her bed in the rear compartment, the May sunshine falling through the window and warming the oak floor. Inside were more photographs. Gran as a young man, maybe 25, standing beside a steam locomotive with a crew of other men. Gran and a woman who must have been his wife posed formally in front of a church. Gran holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket, and underneath the photographs, a stack of letters bound with a rubber band that disintegrated when she touched it. The letters were in different handwriting than Gran's. Smaller, neater, more flowing. She opened the first one carefully. It was dated October 1972 and addressed to Dad. The first few lines made her hands start shaking. "Dad, I know you're angry, and I know you think I'm making a mistake. Maybe I am. But I can't stay in Talcott anymore. I can't work the railroad, and I can't be who you want me to be. I need to find out who I am somewhere else. I'm sorry. I wish I could make you understand. Maybe someday you will." Wyatt, there were more letters, dozens of them. Nora spread them out on the bed and arranged them chronologically by the dates written at the top. November 1972, January 1973, March 1973. They were all from Wyatt, all addressed to Gran, and none of them had ever been sent. They were drafts, she realized. Letters written and rewritten, attempts to explain or apologize, or bridge the distance that had opened between father and son. The early ones were defensive, angry. The later ones were softer, more regretful. By 1975, Wyatt was writing about a job he'd found, a woman he'd met, a life he was building in Charleston. By 1980, he was writing about being married, about Linda, about wanting to bring her to Talcott to meet his father, but not knowing how to make that first contact after so many years of silence. In 1985, he wrote about holding his daughter for the first time. "Dad, I have a daughter. Her name is Nora. She has your eyes. I wish you could meet her. I wish I knew how to pick up the phone and call you and say I'm sorry and I was wrong and can we start over. But I don't know how to do that. I don't know if you'd want to hear from me after all this time. I don't know if you're even still alive. Sometimes I drive past Talcott on Route 3, and I slow down, and I think about turning off and finding you. But I never do. I'm afraid you'll slam the door in my face. I'm afraid you'll tell me it's too late. Maybe it is too late. Maybe some things can't be fixed. I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you know that I think about you every day, and that leaving was the hardest thing I ever did, and that I've regretted it every day since. Your son, Wyatt." Nora read that letter 3 times before she could breathe properly again. She kept reading. The letters continued through the years, sporadic but persistent. 1990. 1995. In September 2000, there was a letter that was longer than the others, more carefully composed, written on better paper. "Dad, I'm 55 years old now. My daughter Nora is 18. Linda and I are still together. We don't have much, but we have each other. I've been thinking about you more lately. About the things we said to each other the night I left. About how angry we both were. About how I told you I never wanted to see you again. And you told me if I walked out that door, I shouldn't bother coming back. We were both wrong. I know that now. Pride is a poison that works slowly, but it works. It's been 28 years since I left home, and I can't get those years back. But maybe we don't have to lose the years ahead. I want to come see you. I want to bring Nora. I want her to know her grandfather. I want you to know her. She's smart and strong, and she doesn't take any nonsense from anyone. She reminds me of you. I don't know if this address is still right. I don't know if you're still in Talcott. I don't even know if you're still alive. But I'm going to put this letter in an envelope, and I'm going to address it, and I'm going to put it on my desk where I can see it every day until I work up the courage to mail it. I hope I do. I hope you read this. I hope you're willing to give me another chance. Your son, Wyatt, September 2000. The letter had never been mailed. It was here in a box in a railroad car 25 years later. Nora looked at the date again. September 2000. Her father had written this when she was 18. She tried to remember what she'd been doing in September 2000, probably starting her senior year of high school, probably working after school at the convenience store, probably having no idea that her father was sitting at a desk somewhere writing a letter to a grandfather she didn't know existed, trying to find the courage to send it. Gran had died in 2003, 3 years after this letter was written. 3 years during which Wyatt could have mailed it, could have driven to Talcott, could have knocked on a door or walked up to a railroad car and said the words that needed to be said. But he hadn't. And Gran had died not knowing that his son had wanted to reconcile, had spent years writing letters he never sent, had a daughter who had his eyes and his stubbornness and who would have loved to know him. Nora sat on the bed surrounded by unsent letters and felt the full weight of what pride had cost 3 generations of Callaways. Gran and Wyatt both too stubborn to bend, both waiting for the other to make the first move, both dying with words unsaid and distances unbridged. And her Nora growing up without a grandfather who would have loved her without stories about the railroad and the mountains and the history that shaped the man her father had been. All of it lost to silence, all of it sacrificed to pride. She gathered the letters carefully and put them back in the box. Then she walked out to the vestibule steps and sat down in the May sunshine and cried for the 3rd time since finding this place. Not for the money or the car or any physical thing, for the years that could have been different, for the Sunday dinners that never happened, for the birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday evenings when family could have been together but weren't, because nobody could find the words to say sorry. She cried until she was empty. Then she sat there watching the wind move through the new leaves and feeling something shift inside her. Not breaking, hardening, crystallizing into a kind of resolve she hadn't known she possessed. This didn't have to be the end of the story. It was the end for Gran and Wyatt, but it didn't have to be the end for her. She could choose differently. She could be the one who bent instead of breaking, who spoke instead of staying silent, who built bridges instead of burning them. She didn't know how yet, but she would figure it out. The next morning, Opal Hutchins came to visit. Nora heard the car before she saw it, an old Buick that rattled up the gravel road and stopped at the gate. She walked out to meet it and found a tiny woman in her late 80s climbing out with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones didn't work the way they used to. "You must be Nora," the woman said. "I'm Opal. Known your grandfather since we were children. Would you like to come in?" "I would." Nora helped her navigate the uneven ground and the vestibule steps, and Opal walked into the railroad car with the slow attention of someone returning to a place they knew well. She ran her hand along the mahogany paneling, looked at the brass fixtures, studied the kitchen area with approving eyes. "You've done good work here," she said. "Real good. Gran would be pleased." "Thank you." Opal settled into one of the armchairs by the wood stove, and Nora made tea. They sat together in the spring sunshine falling through the windows, and Opal told stories. She told about Gran as a boy, serious and quiet, even then helping his father on a small farm outside Talcott. about how he'd left to fight in World War II. Wait, the Dan E said no World War II. Toa Kinsua. She told about Gran as a young man starting work on the railroad in 1946, learning the trade from older men who'd been working the rails since before he was born. About how he'd courted a girl named Margaret, married her in 1949, built a life that was simple but solid. Margaret was a lovely woman, Opal said. Kind, patient. She needed to be married to Gran. He wasn't an easy man. Too much in his head. Too much keeping to himself. But she understood him. She made him softer. What happened to her? Cancer, 1965. Took her in 6 months. Gran was devastated. Wyatt was only 10. I watched Gran try to raise that boy alone, and it broke my heart because he loved Wyatt so much, but he didn't know how to show it. He thought love meant being strict, teaching toughness, making sure Wyatt could handle anything the world threw at him. Opal sipped her tea. But what Wyatt needed was tenderness. What he needed was someone to tell him it was okay to be scared sometimes, okay to not have all the answers. Gran couldn't give him that. Didn't know how. And so they clashed more and more as Wyatt got older, until finally Wyatt left and Gran let him go because that's what Callaway men do. They stand firm. They don't bend. She pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Nora. I found this in my attic last week. Thought you should have it. Inside was a photograph, black and white, creased down the middle where it had been folded. It showed a man standing beside railroad tracks, with mountains in the background. He was in his 60s, wearing overalls and a railroad cap. Beside him, holding his hand with both of his small hands, was a boy about 5 years old. Dark hair, serious face, looking up at the man with complete trust. That's Gran and Wyatt, Opal said. Took that picture myself in 1960. Never saw a man love a child so much. Gran carried that boy everywhere. Taught him everything he knew. They were inseparable. Nora stared at the photograph. At her grandfather's face, younger but recognizable from the picture in the lunchbox. At her father as a child, small and trusting and whole before pride and silence and distance did their work. What happened? She asked. Same thing that always happens. Life, growing up. Wyatt wanted different things than Gran wanted for him. Wanted to see the world beyond Talcott, beyond railroad tracks and coal country. Gran took it personal. Thought it meant Wyatt was rejecting him. Rejecting everything he'd worked for. They fought. Wyatt left. And Gran waited 28 years for him to come back. He never did. No, Opal said softly. He never did. And when Gran died in 2003, I helped clean out his house. There was almost nothing in it. Just a bed and a table and his railroad uniforms hung up in the closet, pressed and clean, even though he hadn't worn them in 25 years. He lived like a monk, like he was keeping everything ready for someone who might return. She finished her tea and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. You're giving him his ending, she said. The one he didn't get. You're the family that came home. That means something. Don't waste it. After Opal left, Nora sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about cycles, about patterns that repeat across generations, about how pain gets passed down like eye color, or stubbornness invisible but potent, shaping lives in ways people don't even recognize. Gran lost his father's savings in the Depression, so he never trusted banks. Gran lost his wife young, so he raised Wyatt with a hardness born of grief. Wyatt grew up without softness, so he left to find it elsewhere. Wyatt left, so Gran spent his life saving for a family he hoped would return. Wyatt stayed away, so Nora grew up without knowing her grandfather. And now Nora at the end of the chain, holding all the accumulated silence and regret and lost chances. She could let it continue. Could stay isolated in this railroad car, protecting herself from further loss by never letting anyone close enough to leave. Could become another Calloway who lived alone and died alone and left everything to chance and hope. Or she could break the pattern. The decision came to her suddenly, fully formed on a Tuesday morning in late May when the dogwoods were in full bloom, and the woods were so green it hurt to look at them. She would open the railroad car to Talcott, not as a museum or a monument, but as a gathering place, a space where people could come together, where stories could be told, and history preserved and community strengthened. Gran had built this place as a refuge from the world. She would turn it into a bridge to the world. It took her a week to prepare. She cleaned everything again, polished the brass until it gleamed, arranged the cigar boxes with care. She created a small corner in the forward section dedicated to Gran's memory. His photograph beside the car, his railroad uniforms on display, the letter from the lunchbox in a frame on the wall, the unsent letter from Boone's envelope beside it. She didn't include Wyatt's unsent letters. Those felt too personal, too raw. She kept them in the wooden box in her bedroom. Private grief that didn't need to be public. On a Saturday in early June, she invited Talcott. She didn't send formal invitations. She just mentioned it to Ruth at the post office, who mentioned it to Dale at the fire department, who mentioned it to everyone he saw that week. Word spread. On Saturday afternoon, people started arriving. They came on foot mostly. The gravel road wasn't built for much traffic. They came in ones and twos, curious and cautious, not sure what to expect. Boone was there, of course, standing near the gate like a sentinel. Opal arrived in her Buick, driven by a grandson Nora hadn't known existed. Dale brought his wife. Ruth brought her husband. Others came that Nora didn't know yet, wouldn't know until they introduced themselves and shook her hand and told her how they'd known Gran. By mid-afternoon, there were maybe 60 people gathered in the clearing around the railroad car. More than Nora had expected. More than she'd been prepared for. She stood on the vestibule steps and looked at them all, and her throat closed with something that might have been fear, or might have been gratitude, or might have been both at once. Boone stepped forward. "Most of you knew Gran Calloway," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet. "Worked with him, saw him in town, knew him as a neighbor. But most of you didn't know this place existed. Didn't know he lived here for 25 years. Didn't know he'd been saving money for a family he'd lost contact with." He gestured to Nora. "This is his granddaughter, Nora. She found this place last September with her last $10. Found the money Gran saved. Found his letter. And she spent the past 8 months rebuilding what time and weather had damaged, making it into a home, honoring his memory by finishing what he started. People were quiet listening. I helped her some, Boone continued. Taught her what Gran taught me about building things right. But she did the work. Got up every morning and learned skills she didn't have. Made mistakes and fixed them. Kept going through winter that would have broken most people. She earned this place. Earned the right to call herself Gran's kin. He looked at Nora. You want to say something? She didn't particularly, but she stepped forward anyway. My grandfather and my father didn't speak for 28 years, she said. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, and people leaned in to hear. They both wanted to reconcile. They both wrote letters, but neither of them sent what they wrote. Pride or fear or just the weight of time passing. I don't know. What I know is they both died without making peace, without saying the things they needed to say. She paused, gathering herself. I can't change that. Can't go back and make them talk to each other. Can't give my father the grandfather he missed or give my grandfather the son he waited for. But I can choose differently. Can choose connection over isolation. Can choose to let people in instead of keeping them out. She gestured to the railroad car. This place is open to anyone from Talcott who wants to visit, who wants to share stories about Gran, who wants to use it as a gathering space. It's still my home, but it's also part of this town's history, and history belongs to everyone. There was a moment of silence. Then Opal started clapping, slow and deliberate, and others joined in until the clearing was full of applause that echoed off the trees and the steel sides of the railroad car. People came inside after that. They walked through the compartments and examined the work and told Nora stories she'd never heard. About Gran stopping to help a stranded motorist in a snowstorm. About Gran fixing a widow's fence without being asked. About Gran lending money to a young couple starting out never expecting to be paid back. He wasn't warm, an old man named Chester said, but he was good. There's a difference. Warm is easy. Good takes work. A woman named Marie brought a casserole she'd made, and others had brought food too. And soon there was an impromptu potluck happening in the clearing. People sat on logs and tailgates eating and talking, and children ran through the trees the way children do when adults are distracted. Nora moved through it all feeling slightly overwhelmed and deeply grateful. These people didn't know her anything. But they'd shown up anyway because she was Gran's blood, and because she'd done the work, and because in a town like Talcott that was enough. As the sun started to set, painting the sky orange and purple over the ridgeline, Boone pulled her aside. You did good today, he said. It feels strange, having people here. It should. You've been alone a long time, but alone isn't the same as lonely, and lonely isn't the same as strong. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let people help you carry things. He looked out at the gathering, at the people talking and laughing and sharing food. Gran lived alone, but he died alone too. You don't have to repeat that. You can have this. Community. Connection. People who show up. I don't know how to do that, Nora said. How to let people in. Same way you learn to solder pipe and install insulation. One step at a time. One mistake at a time. One day at a time. The gathering broke up as darkness fell. People drifted back down the gravel road, calling goodbyes, promising to return. Opal hugged Nora before she left, fierce despite her small frame. Dale shook her hand and said the fire department could use volunteer help if she was interested. Ruth invited her to church on Sunday. By 8 o'clock, everyone was gone except Boone, who helped her clean up the food and stack the borrowed chairs. "You gonna be okay?" he asked. "Yeah," Nora said. "I think I am." After he left, she sat on the vestibule steps in the darkness and listened to the night sounds of the forest. Crickets, a distant owl, the faint rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. The stars were out, brilliant and countless the way they only are in places far from city lights. She thought about the day, about 60 people showing up for a grandfather they'd known and a granddaughter they hadn't, about casseroles and stories and children playing in the woods, about Boone's words, about choosing connection over isolation. She thought about the letters in the wooden box in her bedroom, all those unsent attempts at reconciliation, all those words that never found their recipients. And she thought about how different things might have been if just one of those letters had been mailed. If Gran had reached out one more time. If Wyatt had found the courage to send what he wrote. Small moments, small choices, but they compound over time, building into lives live in silence, or lives live in connection. Nora couldn't change the past, couldn't give Gran and Wyatt the reconciliation they'd needed. But she could live differently, could be the Calloway who bent instead of breaking, who spoke instead of staying silent, who chose every day to reach out instead of pulling back. The railroad car behind her was warm and quiet, lit by the soft glow of the reading lamp in her bedroom. Inside were all the things that made it home. The shelves and compartments, the wood stove and the kitchen counter, the cigar boxes arranged just so, the photographs on the wall, the letters in their frames. But it wasn't really the things that made it home. It was the choice to stay, to build, to let people in, to honor the past while creating a different future. Summer came to the mountains. The days grew long and hot. Nora fell into a rhythm that felt sustainable. She worked odd jobs around Talcott, using the skills Boone had taught her. Carpentry, plumbing, small repairs that people needed done. She didn't charge much. Didn't need to, with Gran's savings still mostly intact in the bank. But she liked the work, liked being useful. Liked the way people's faces changed when she fixed something that had been broken. She joined the volunteer fire department, attended training sessions, learned how to handle a hose and work a ladder truck and stay calm in emergencies. Dale took her under his wing the way Boone had, teaching through demonstration rather than explanation. She went to church some Sundays. Not because she was particularly religious, but because Ruth had invited her and because showing up seemed important. The congregation was small and aging, mostly people in their 60s and 70s, and they welcomed her with the warmth of people who understood that young blood in a dying town was precious. She became part of Talcott, not a visitor, not an outsider, part of the fabric of the place. In August, a young woman showed up at the railroad car. She was maybe 19, thin and pale with a backpack that looked like it held everything she owned. She stood at the gate uncertain until Nora walked over. "Can I help you?" "I heard there was a place here," the girl said. "A railroad car where someone lived. I thought maybe, I don't know. I thought maybe I could see it." Nora looked at her and saw herself 9 months ago. The same desperation in the eyes. The same careful way of taking up as little space as possible. "What's your name?" "Lily." "You got somewhere to go tonight, Lily?" The girl shook her head. Nora made a decision that felt inevitable, like water finding its level. "Come on inside. I'll make coffee." They sat in the living area, and Lily told her story haltingly. Family troubles, no money, been on the road for 3 months, sleeping in shelters when they were available, outside when they weren't. Nora listened without judging, without offering advice she hadn't been asked for. When Lily finished, Nora said, "There's an extra compartment in this car. Used to be a sleeping berth. If you want to stay for a while, until you figure out your next step, you can use it." Lily looked at her with suspicion born of experience. "What do you want?" "Nothing. But if you stay, you work. There's always work to do. Firewood to split, gardens to tend, repairs to make. You pull your weight. That's it. That's it." Lily stayed. Tentatively, at first, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. But the trouble never came. She helped Nora split wood and weed the garden and repair a section of the water line that had developed a slow leak. She was quiet, watchful, slow to trust. Nora understood. She'd been the same way. Over weeks, Lily relaxed. Started talking more. Started smiling occasionally. Started looking less like someone who expected the world to hurt her, and more like someone who thought maybe it wouldn't. One evening in September, exactly a year after Nora had bought the railroad car, they sat on the vestibule steps watching the sun set. "Why are you helping me?" Lily asked. Nora thought about it. "Someone left something for me when I had nothing. Money, yeah. But more than that. A chance. A place. A way forward. I can't pay that back to the person who gave it to me. He's gone. But I can pass it forward. To me. To you. To whoever needs it next. That's how it works, I think. You receive grace, and then you extend grace. Not to the same people. To whoever comes after." Lily was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I want to learn what you know. Building things, fixing things. I can teach you. But it won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is." Nora smiled. "You sound like my grandfather." They sat together as the light faded from the sky, two young women in a railroad car in the woods, both of them learning how to build lives out of what had been left behind. October came around again. The leaves turned. The air grew crisp. 1 year since Nora had walked this path for the first time, her backpack on her shoulders and $10 in her pocket, not knowing what she would find. She marked the anniversary by reading Gran's letter again. The one from the lunchbox. The one that had started everything. "This money is what I earned and saved honest. If anyone from my family finds this, they should know I never forgot about them." She had found it. She had known. And now she was doing what he couldn't do, what Wyatt couldn't do. She was staying. She was connecting. She was choosing love over pride and community over isolation and grace over silence. The railroad car was no longer just Gran's refuge. It was Nora's home. It was Lily's sanctuary. It was Talcott's gathering place. It was proof that some things can be lost for decades and still be found. That some distances can be crossed even after the people who made them are gone. That inheritance isn't just what gets passed down, but what gets transformed by the people who receive it. On a Saturday in late October, Boone came by with his thermos and they walked the property together, checking systems and discussing what needed to be done before winter. It had become their ritual, this Saturday walk, this quiet accounting of what was working and what needed attention. They stopped at the water tank and Boone inspected the lines, nodded his approval. Everything was sound. Everything would hold. "You've done well," he said. "Better than I expected, if I'm honest. You doubted me at first, but you proved me wrong. Proved everyone wrong who thought you'd leave when the first real cold hit." He looked at her with something that might have been pride. Gran would be proud. Not just of the work, of who you've become. I'm still figuring that out. We all are. Until the day we die, we're all still figuring it out. They walked back to the railroad car in comfortable silence. At the vestibule, Boone paused. "I never told you this," he said. "But that letter I didn't send, the one from Gran to your father. I've regretted it every day for 26 years. It's the biggest failure of my life. Not because I was lazy or cruel, but because I respected the wrong thing. I respected Gran's pride more than his heart. And that choice meant 2 men died without reconciling. You couldn't have known." "No. But I could have tried harder. Could have driven to Charleston and knocked on doors until I found Wyatt. Could have done something instead of nothing." He looked directly at her. "Don't make the same mistake. When you have the chance to reach out, to connect, to say the hard thing that needs to be said, don't wait. Don't respect pride more than love. That's the lesson. That's what I learned too late." He walked away before she could respond. His boots crunching on the gravel. His thermos tucked under his arm. Nora stood on the steps and watched him go. And she thought about all the people in her life now. Boone and Opal and Dale and Ruth. and the dozens of others who had woven themselves into her days. And she thought about Lily inside the railroad car washing dishes and humming quietly to herself, learning to trust again. She thought about cycles breaking and patterns changing and the slow, patient work of becoming someone different than the people who came before you. That night, she sat at the small desk she'd built in her bedroom and wrote a letter, not to anyone who was gone, but to someone who might come, to a child or grandchild or great-grandchild who might one day find this place and wonder about the woman who lived here. She wrote about Gran and Wyatt and the 28 years of silence between them. She wrote about buying a railroad car for $10 and finding a fortune and a family history she never knew existed. She wrote about learning to build with her hands and letting people into her life and choosing connection over isolation. And she wrote about the most important thing she'd learned. The lesson that had taken a year of hard work and harder choices to understand. The best inheritance isn't money. It's not property or possessions or things that can be counted and valued and passed down. The best inheritance is the chance to do better than the people before you, to take what they built and build on it, to take what they broke and fix it, to take their unfinished stories and give them endings that matter. She folded the letter and put it in an envelope and wrote on the outside, "To whoever comes after." Then she put it in the lunchbox with Gran's letter and Boone's unsent letter and all the other artifacts of a family that had struggled to stay connected, but had finally, through her, found a way. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees. Inside, the wood stove crackled and Lily was reading in the living area, and everything was warm and safe and home. Nora Calloway sat in the railroad car her grandfather had bought for $50 and saved in for 20 years. And she thought about the strange and winding path that had led her here, from homelessness to home, from isolation to community, from the end of one story to the beginning of another. She had spent her last $10 on rusted metal in the woods, and in return, she had received not just money or shelter, but something much more valuable. She had received the chance to be the person who bent when her grandfather and father had broken, the person who spoke when they had stayed silent, the person who reached out when they had pulled back. She had received the chance to finish what they started, to honor their memory not by preserving it in amber, but by letting it grow and change and become something new. Welcome home, she thought. Welcome home, Gran. Welcome home, Dad. Welcome home, Nora. The railroad car held them all now. 3 generations of Callaways under one roof at last. Not in body, but in spirit. Not in the past, but in the present. Not in silence, but in the quiet, ongoing conversation between what was and what is and what will be. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The river flowed through the valley, patient and eternal. The mountains stood watch the way they had for millions of years and would for millions more. And inside the railroad car at the end of a dead track in the hills of West Virginia, a young woman who had once had nothing sat warm and safe and surrounded by the slow-built evidence that some things broken can be mended, some distances crossed, Some stories given endings they were never supposed to have, but that somehow, against all odds, they found anyway. The light burned late into the night. The wood stove kept everything warm. And when morning came, Nora Calloway would wake up in her home, in her place, in the life she had built with $10 and her hands, and the stubborn refusal to give up that ran in her blood. She had found her inheritance, and now she was becoming it.